This is Dr. Jerome Corsi, and today is Monday. It's June 12th, 2023. And I want to cover quite a bit today. I'm going to start with this article that appeared over the weekend. It was on what they're calling working from home and empty offices are leading to what they're calling a doom loop, D-O-O-M, doom loop for New York City. Now, what it means, this is a study that's coming out of the one of the Stern Business School, NYU, Columbia Business School, and the National Bureau of Economic Research. There's several groups working on this. What they're saying is that many employees who, of course, worked from home during the pandemic just have not returned to work in offices, at least not full time. So in 2020, office occupancy fell from 90% to 10% during the pandemic when very few people were going into offices, but it's only bounced back to 48.4% in New York. Now, in response, the problem is with less coming in terms of vacancy, less revenue coming into the landlords who own these commercial buildings in New York, the number of newly signed leases has fallen from 285.4 million feet per year before the pandemic to only 62.4 million feet in the same period after the pandemic. Now, the reason they're calling this a doom loop is because that with fewer office rentals in downtown Manhattan, there's going to be less tax revenue coming in for the city. About a 6.5 drop in revenue by 2029 is being predicted, tax revenue, which is a serious problem for cities like New York, which are heavily dependent on rental income, generating tax money in commercial businesses to sustain city services. At any rate, the vacancy rates are at 30-year highs in many American cities. And the New York's vacancy rate is 22% in 2023's first quarter. So rents are going to fall, and there's going to be failed businesses, failed buildings, because they with lower tenancy, they're going to have less revenue to these buildings coming into the landlords when they have to refinance. They often have interest-only loans on the commercial buildings. They have a big payout at the end of the loan to pay off the principal. They can't refinance the building at a higher price. These buildings may go into bankruptcy, having New York essentially turn into not necessarily initially a ghost town, but certainly a diminished city. And this is happening to cities all across the country. We're finding that the Democratic rule in these cities is disastrous. Now, let's take a look at San Francisco. And I've been highlighting San Francisco. I used to live actually in Portland, Oregon, if you can believe it, in the 80s, before it became quite as insane as it is today. And spent a lot of time in San Francisco with various of the financial interests in the financial district. It was in the early days of the securitizing mortgages, and I was involved with that process when I was in financial services. At any rate, San Francisco is now, as we reported last week, hotel owners are starting to write off business in San Francisco in fairly massive ways. This is a Wall Street Journal article this week, today, and it says basically homeowners start to write off San Francisco as business nosedives. City's lodging business has been squeezed by crime and other quality of life issues, just like the massive homelessness, the rampant LGBT in-your-face community, feces on the street, filth. Well, San Francisco's also had a downtown crisis, as people are just not coming into the downtowns. Why would you go into the downtowns when they're so dangerous, and they're confrontative? I mean, basically, who wants to have to watch where you're walking, not for the dog poop, but for the human poop? I mean, it's ridiculous. These democratic cities are becoming hellholes. Well, also the San Francisco growing number, I'm just going to read a little bit of this article. Growing number of San Francisco hoteliers are signaling they may be ready to give up. In recent months, the owner of the city's Huntington Hotel sold the property after facing foreclosure, and the Yotel San Francisco Hotel sold in a foreclosure auction. Club Quarters San Francisco, which has been in default loans since 2020, may also be headed to foreclosure. We reported last week that the Hilton Hotel, this Park 55, two of the trendier hotels in San Francisco, are just giving up. They're not going to pay their loans anymore. They're just giving up. We have national retailers in San Francisco like Nordstrom's, Crate and Barrel, H&M. They've closed their San Francisco downtown stores, which were often their flagship stores. And tourism is declining, and the convention business is down, upon which San Francisco depends to fill its hotels. So the Park Hotel's property is a test case. They're saying the Hilton in San Francisco Union Square, which is probably the most trendy part of the downtown commercial shopping area, and Park 55 were praised at more than $1.5 billion in 2016, generating more than $100 million in net operating income in 2019. The hotel lost more than $90 million between 2020 and 2022, and the properties were closed for much of that time. They've been recovering over the past years. The group and leisure travel increased, but they faced $200 million in needed improvements, and they just gave up. They also needed to refinance its interest-only $725 million loan scheduled to mature in November in order to maintain the ownership of the hotels. And Truist securities analyst Patrick Scholes said after rising interest rates are putting pressure on the commercial landlords with interest rate-only loans, as higher borrowing costs make refinancing less attractive. So this is the decline. Donald Trump said the other day, we are in decline as a country. I think the signs of decline are manifest, and I believe we're into a credit crisis that is going to collapse. Now, I want to have Chris comment in a minute, but I want to point out a couple of things. Number one, we're going to begin publicizing here on the 15th. We're going to start doing media appearances on this book on the coming global crash will create an historic gold rush. I'm predicting that we're going through much of what a combination of 1970 when we had an energy crisis. We've got another one because of the Green New Deal push to have us stop using hydrocarbon fuels and go to electric power, which is a massive change. By the way, the other book I want to highlight, I just got, this is a new book by Michael Hudson. He is a historian, and this is a monumental work. It's a huge work. It's published by one of the Europe's top scientific publishers, which is Verlag. It's a German publisher. Beautifully designed book. But what he's demonstrating is that the collapse of antiquity, both in Greece and in Rome, antiquity collapsed because of the creditor-debtor problems. In other words, the creditors became an oligarchy, and they pushed the renters into poverty in Rome. And the final basic land grabs, instead of having a system which they had evolved from a much earlier part of antiquity where debts were forgiven, the oligarchs became increasingly greedy and increasingly took the land to themselves, and everyone else became indebted to them, and they couldn't pay the debt. So the fiscal crisis, the fall of Rome has often been attributed to the moral decline. And this is the first time I've seen an historian take seriously the issue that there was also a financial collapse. And I think we're going through much the same in the United States, that we have got a collapse going on of our moral fiber. Families are under attack for this neo-Marxism, this insane, woke LGBT policy, which again is, once you have we've always had a certain percentage, very small, of homosexuals, lesbians, transgenders. We've lived with that population going on for centuries. But when that population asserts rights and wants to be the dominant group, wants to set the dominant sexual mores for the society, now you've got a problem. And that's going to be experienced. I think we'll go through the same kind of difficulties ancient Rome did. Ancient Rome, of course, turned Christian, another one of the big phenomenons in the ancient world. Under Constantine, the pagan gods were given up, and Rome went to Christianity. I think the mothers were just tired of their children being turned into sexual perverts. As paganism descended into a kind of transgender madness that, again, went hand in hand with the fiscal problems, and we're repeating the pattern. San Francisco is probably the case study of a city in moral decline that is now in economic decline, as people do not want to confront the homelessness, the transgenders in your face, the filth of the city, the crime, the democratic rule, the fact that the city is going broke. And as the businesses and hotels pull out, San Francisco is on a very, very deep decline that will be followed by this loop. It becomes a circular process where the city has less revenues, city's going to go into more debt. You're going to have essentially a debt crisis in which the city will eventually collapse. It's like the Cloward-Piven theory, basically. Two sociologists at Columbia University who caused the New York financial crisis in the 70s just said, increase social services, the government will go broke, then we can have communism. Chris, do you want to comment?
I have a friend who I went to college with. He's gay. He and his husband moved to San Francisco for a while and moved back to the Capital District area here in New York. I saw him a couple of years after he moved in when he visited his parents in the old stomping grounds, and I asked him, "What's San Francisco like?" And he looked at me and said, "It's a bubble within a bubble within a bubble. It's really bad." And this guy is as left as you can find. He's not an angry lefty guy, but the fact is, what he was telling me, there was a bunch of angry lefties there who live in a sort of a very closed society, and it's neighborhood closed society. So if you're in a small group and you have all of those great pride parades and the rainbows flashing around, you think that's the only part of San Francisco there is, when all the troubles surrounding these people, they barely even acknowledge or barely even know. This was years ago, before all these things were coming to light. So you had the homelessness, you had the feces, and you had the crime problems. They've just been elevated greatly since the George Floyd thing, because this whole defund the police became fashionable. So what the lefties always wanted to do, from, I'm going to say, the 70s onward, because we know how the socialists were involved with the city back then, they figured they were free to do those things now, and it was, dare I say, hip.
Well, and it's also cumulative. Now it's not the rainbow influence on San Francisco is not confined to a small area. It's now the dominant culture, and it's throughout the city. It pervades every aspect of the city, and it's confrontative. It's in your face. The homelessness is obvious even in the downtown areas, and they can't get rid of it.
There are just people back in the day, back in the 70s and 80s, who just wanted to be themselves and be left alone. Those people are long gone. Apparently, these movements were hijacked by very special interests, and we're talking about the extra letters, the socialists. They hijack these movements and turn them into something worse, and this is why people are finally fighting back against what's been going on.
Let's shift to the climate area. There are a few pretty important articles that came out over the weekend and today. One is that the study, which has been going on for some time, I reported on it in my book on energy. I'll point that out in a moment. But this is from the Heartland Institute. Essentially, the nationwide study is showing that 96% of our climate data is corrupted, largely because these stations, you see, we've got to monitor temperature. In other words, say, what's the temperature of the Earth? That's a very difficult question because it varies every few meters. And how are you going to measure it? Well, it takes sophisticated equipment to measure the temperature accurately and to get a baseline where you can look at variances. And it's time series data, which is hard to evaluate. But if you don't have good data, in other words, when you look at the Heartland Institute study, basically when this guy Anthony Watts, who's a senior fellow, has spent his time visiting and going and measuring all these different national weather systems that are set up to measure temperature at various places in the United States, and also then it's a system around the globe. And it's run by NOAA, which is one of the major climate agencies, and it measures the weather stations. But the problem is that the weather stations, he basically surveyed 1,000 weather stations and found that 89% of the stations had heat bias issues. They were biasing towards heat. And that means that the data is skewed. The evidence is in this new study, which they've just released, confirmed the 2009 report. Basically, the new study is evidence of two things. First, the government is either inept or stubbornly refuses to learn from its mistakes for political reasons. And second, the government's official temperature record cannot be trusted. It reflects a clear urban heat bias effect, not national temperature trends. And we've known for a long time that the urban areas, of course, are warmer, all the concrete, all the activity. But the urban areas can bias the data if you want to look at the national data. This is another theme, and I want to. There's a couple of books I want to highlight today. One was this book, The Collapse of Antiquity. Another one I'm going to highlight, which I think is extremely important, is this book. It's called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. It's by Matthias Desmet, who is he's professor of clinical psychology at Ghent University in Belgium. And his argument is that what we're seeing in these movements, climate change movements, the woke movement, etc., COVID, the reaction to COVID, is what he's calling mass formation. It's a psychological phenomenon. I refer to it as the madness of crowds. This has been studied for a long time. Even when I was a graduate student, I was writing about Gustave Le Bon, who was a French sociologist who pointed out the phenomenon of crowds. One of the key points that Desmond makes is that we've all given over to scientific authority. A scientist says it. Fauci, who's supposedly a medical scientist, says COVID is such and such. The public is likely to believe it. But the problem is that if you look at social science or hard science research, an enormous percentage of it is corrupted by bad data. Either people don't bother, or sometimes they fabricate the data. That's become a trend in academics. But certainly the study of the NOAA bias of urban measuring heat from cities, biasing the temperature readings that NOAA is relying upon to say that we've got global warming going on. That's a major problem, because people tend to say, well, it's the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Surely they can't be wrong. Well, again, it's nonsense. And I'm writing desperately this whole set of books to try to make this point. The book about the truth about energy, global warming, and climate change. And believe me, my goal is not to sell books. My goal here is basically to get you to read them. I mean, you can't give books away because people don't read books you give away. You've got to have enough interest in it to buy it. You buy it, you may read it. The problem is that the science of global warming is predicated on enormously magnifying the role of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases do keep the planet survivable because all the irradiance of the sun would escape at night without greenhouse gases. This place would be too cold to live in. So if you take a look at the study, we have massive changes in the climate that are catastrophic, way beyond the control of human beings. And one of them is going to be this El Nino wind pattern, water pattern, the ocean currents that are now going to affect the temperature around the United States and worldwide, and may produce some more dramatic weather events like hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. These are natural phenomena. The Earth has been going through these for centuries. It has no relationship to carbon dioxide or industrial activity. That is the neo-Marxist argument that has taken over all these ideologies. And Christopher, you'll show the second book, which is in press. It's coming out. It's this book is called The Truth About It. I'm writing all these the truth. This is the Truth Central. The only remedy to this, and that's the end conclusion that Desmond comes to, is that there's a small group always that perceives the lies in this, and it's incumbent upon us to speak up and to point out the lies in all of this. It's the only remedy to this mass psychosis we have of believing this false information. And the motive behind it, as Chris just pointed out a minute ago, is that the Marxists come over, they take this over because they want to destroy capitalism, and Marxism is only good at destruction. The woke is only good at destruction. The climate change movement is only good at destruction. Now let's carry on the next with two stories here that I have on The Truth Central today. One is by Andrea Widberg at the AmericanThinker.com. She's actually my editor at the AmericanThinker.com. She edits my work there. She does a beautiful job of it. I think she's an excellent editor. And what she's written is an article here now saying that there's evidence, and strong evidence, that these fires in Canada that blanketed the American Northeast last week with this thick orange smoke, and it was obnoxious. It was very difficult to breathe. Was intentional. These fires were put on by purpose. They're eco-terrorism. The left has learned that they can create these disasters and then blame it on climate change, and the left is willing to burn down thousands of acres of forestry. What she points out is that the satellite images, and I've watched the satellite films extensively over the weekend, that show that these fires across northern Canada and the east were started almost simultaneously. Like the satellites show no fires, and suddenly there's the entire Northeast is ablaze all at one time. And it was ablaze right at the time in Quebec, Canada, when the wind patterns were going to blow that smoke down into the United States, into the northeastern part of the United States. And it was like the neo-Marxists saying, you don't believe in climate change. Well, let me show you what climate change is like. And they immediately, the press came out and said Canada's wildfires were about global warming. Of course, everything that happens is global warming. We have a unusually cold winter, that's global warming. You know, global warming means nothing. It just means that it's the new fear-mongering term the left can use to get us to stop using hydrocarbon fuels. So this Nixon, Nickson, who posted a tweet, basically was studying and looking at these various videos and saying essentially this matches research that's been done for a long time, saying that arson is what causes a lot of these wildfires. Now, I'm combining that with an article that Mark Morano, and I dedicated the book on climate change to Mark Morano. This next article here is the Mark Morano's article saying essentially that the UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reveals that the Canadian fires are not due to climate change. And this was an important article. Mark published this in climatedepot.com. and I follow it very closely. Mark says, "You're being conned. The media and climate activists are again weaponizing wildfires and linking them to climate change. Wildfires, both globally and in Canada, have been declining significantly. Despite these facts, climate activists now want to use Canada's wildfires as another excuse to take away even more of our freedoms and to raise the price of electricity. Better forest management, cracking down on arson, and improving fire impression practices are what is needed, not the Green New Deal." Mark continued, "Blaming global warming for fires makes them, quote, our fault. It's our SUVs, our gas stoves, which have caused these Canadian fires and smoke. Now, they can use this as a premise to justify more regulations to fix the problem. First, masks, stay-at-home orders, school and business closings, sporting event cancellations. Second, it's time to fix the climate. We'll have to give up more freedoms and more modern necessities like gas-powered cars, eating meat, home appliances, freedom of movement, and cheap, reliable energy. Welcome to climate lockdowns." Now, this is exactly the theme that Matthias Desmet articulates, and I encourage everybody to read this book. You can get it on Amazon. And what he says is basically, once these narratives get established, which are constructed realities, they're based on fear. They're based on kind of a need for us to have control, to believe in government and science. Once we begin to believe these climate change ideologies, then the skewed data doesn't matter. The confirmation bias, any data that seems to support what the ideology says, and that is that using hydrocarbon fuels is evil, and the planet's going to, we can control the temperature of the planet, which is nonsense, and that the government can then take in, and during the pandemic, those who got vaccinated, the whole meme, the whole narrative was that the anti-vaxxers are the ones who are the criminals, because they're the ones who are going to propagate the virus through the community. Well, that also was nonsense. Were not scientifically based truths. What we saw was that many of the patients who died were intubated in their initial treatment, which probably was the exact wrong thing to do. The hospitals may have killed a lot of these patients. Isolating the old in these nursing homes and not allowing families to come in and see them was not only cruel, vicious, and heartless, but it probably also encouraged the deaths of these people as a fact, just because of loneliness and a feeling of alienation. They couldn't even visit their families in their last days. How horrible is that? The extreme measures by the believers get taken. The enforcement of masks. There's no data the masks were effective. But as soon as we get anything affecting the climate negatively, a hurricane, a tornado, wildfires causing pollution for several days in New York City, immediately they say, we've got to put on the masks, you got to stay home, we've got to have control. All these things are about government control and totalitarianism. And his whole point is we're going through another mass psychosis right now that was similar to the kind of mass psychosis that went on in Nazi Germany. They all believed in Hitler as the Fuhrer, and were willing to prosecute and eliminate ultimately the Holocaust to eradicate Jews from Europe. And this insanity is what we're going through again. And this is what I have written the second book on the neo-Marxism, cultural Maoism, and our anarchy, because what happens is it ends up anarchy. It ends up with the Black Lives Matters destroying cities, because again, they believe in, racism being structural racism. The entire society is racist and everything becomes racist. Or the LGBT with their pride. Now we have Pride Month and Biden's flying a pride flag from the White House. All this is a mass psychosis. It's not based in the control of the media, the the control of the government, Department of Justice, the control of the government agencies, and we get tons and tons and tons of regulations coming down. So many regulations you can't even, no one can remember them all. And enforced by agencies which have power to do so. Chris, do you want to comment?
Well, again, like we were discussing before, you remember back in high school, there was always the bullies. When I was growing up, that you had your rite of passage with the bullies. Sort of the late '80s, early '90s, there was
Right.
this anti-bullying movement. In the late '90s, with the Columbine shooting, I get that. You don't want to see the one kid get picked on, and we're naturally protectors. You want to step in. You don't want to see the gay kid in school being picked on or somebody else. Either way, nowadays this has been taken to an extreme, to the point where, again, those who hijacked their particular movements have become the bullies, and the people who followed have become the bullies of today. If you don't follow what they tell you, you're a bad person. If you don't portray us in a positive light, always, you're a horrible person. You're some kind of whatever ist or phobe that they can make up this week or next week.
That's exactly right. And let's cover the last story here, which I think is in some ways maybe even the most important. This Trump indictment, which is seriously disturbing, which is clearly a political indictment. There's a lot of good stories coming out about it. I think the Department of Justice has clearly now overstepped and made it absolutely apparent to the American people that we have a KGB, a Stasi. The Department of Justice is a political arm of the Democratic Party, an enforcement arm. And again, as this book points out, and I point out in my books, that basically this is a form of totalitarianism. You're not allowed to dissent. Even what we're saying in this program is going to, we had be silenced. They wanted to put me in prison with the Russian collusion hoax. Well, they're still going after Donald Trump. I refused to take their plea deal, and I was never indicted. Now, the Donald Trump fundraising has just gone through the roof, and his polls, I've seen his polls, he's way ahead of DeSantis, 35 or 40 points ahead of DeSantis. Pence has only got 1 or 2% support. Pence might as well not bother. Trump is clearly going to be the nominee, especially after this indictment. And the Democrats in Congress are after Trump viciously again. I mean, this guy, Trump has been through, first it was the Russian collusion for 2016. That lasted until 2019. Then we had 2 impeachment attempts, one over the Russian collusion suppressing evidence, and the other one over Ukraine, talking to Zelensky about Biden. And the Republicans in Congress are protecting Biden. They're not protecting Trump. Republican Party doesn't support Trump, and Trump is Republican he's the one who's been Republican in name only. And I think the rhinos are clearly Democrat light as a uniparty. So Trump's fundraising is up. His polls are up. Trump has said even if he's convicted, he'll run from prison. Eugene Debs, the labor organizer in the 1900s, early 1900s, World War I period, was put into prison. He ran for president from prison. I think he got like 1 million votes. And he was a railroad executive, and he was solidly against World War I. And that put him at odds with the Justice Department. He was in prison for a speech he gave in Canton, Ohio, which they said violated the Espionage Act. They're trying Trump under the Espionage Acts. The U.S. Archives is overwhelmed by missing records. Thomas Lifton wrote an article about this. He is the force behind AmericanThinker.com. And he pointed out that there's tons of Obama records missing. Biden had tons of records that were classified all over the place. They found them in his garage. Think anything's going to happen to Biden? Biden, we now have the documents released very reluctantly from the Department of Justice that shows that Biden was paid bribes in Ukraine to change U.S. government policy. This entire Ukrainian war is an artifact of Democrats getting bribery and paid. Clinton, Hillary, as Secretary of State, and Biden as Vice President and as President by Ukraine through his son, often millions and millions of dollars. You think Biden should be indicted for treason? You think it'll happen? Probably not, because we don't have justice in the United States. Now, Donald Trump has given speeches talking strongly. I encouraged him to do this when he had his first term. I wrote a book called Killing the Deep State. It said move the entire bureaucracy out to Death Valley. Get rid of these bureaucrats. The entire Beltway is now woke. It's like San Francisco. This woke ideology has captivated. You can't get an agency job. You can't get a university job. You can't get a major newspaper or media job unless you're woke. Well, what defeats these people is that the fruits of their tree, what they produce is destruction. They're going to destroy the standard of living for Americans. We can't have gas stoves. We have to have electric cars. And one of the other articles, maybe I'll cover it tomorrow, but there's now reports coming out from the World Economic Forum saying we need to reduce about 95% of all the car ownership in the world, and especially the United States needs to go. We need to transform our cities into mass transit. These people are rapidly engineering a future that no one would want to live in. I think Donald Trump will triumph here. He's beaten every one of these challenges. I think he'll beat this one too. The case is going to be tried in Florida, not in Washington. He has a chance of getting a better jury down there. And this case is so flimsy. Donald Trump, as president, can declassify anything he wants to declassify. And the classification law was not made to restrict the president. It was made to restrict those beneath the president. And there's articles coming out saying the Department of Justice is saying these have classified markings on them, these documents. Well, of course they do. A declassified document still has the markings on it from when it was classified. That doesn't mean it is still classified. This is a bogus prosecution, just like the two impeachments were bogus impeachments, like and I encourage people to understand that we're going through a coup d'etat. Again, the corpus of books that I've written probably are not going to be read entirely until after I'm dead. But I pointed out during the Russian collusion that the entire thing was a hoax. The Russians did not steal the emails from the Democratic National Party. Trump did not have a pee party with prostitutes in a Russian hotel. These things were scurrilous fabrications. The Department of Justice spent millions and millions of dollars conducting an international investigation in which the Department of Justice was the criminals, fabricating testimony to try to impeach Donald Trump. This is Trump derangement syndrome, and it's got to come to an end. Chris, any final comments?
Oh, yeah, remember that Tom Arnold quest to find that P tape? That was pretty. Every celebrity was jumping on the anti-Trump bandwagon because they've been ignored for the last 10 years, and they're finally trying to make some money for themselves. Then all this stuff never worked out. And here's the interesting point I'm thinking here. If you watch media reports about the Trump indictment, they're always saying Trump had classified documents, which, as you pointed out, is factually incorrect. Every document that has been picked up was declassified. So the deeper argument is Trump has no right to declassify, which is absolutely factually incorrect as well. But when you see the headlines, it's always Trump indicted for having classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Trump, and they're lying to you by saying it's classified because they want to get that in your head where it's in regular conversation at the water cooler, but he had classified documents because it was on the news.
Right. The news said it. The New York Times said it. I mean,
right.
It's this mass hysteria, this mass formation is what does
mass manipulation.
It's like hypnosis.
Right.
It's like they become so. It's a big lie repeated authoritatively as if it were true. The Department of Justice says so. It has to be true. Well, the Department of Justice is corrupt as it comes,
yes,
and should be completely disbanded. And we can't have political justice. If we do, we're like a banana republic where, the former president is now under indictment. This happens in, third world countries. And the president who's in office is the one who's the criminal, and we've got documentary evidence on it, and the Department of Justice won't touch him. So we have, the true criminal president indicting a president who's out to save America.
The same president who was impeached for doing something that the current president did.
It's outrageous. and we will continue reporting on it. And again, let's wrap up today. Stay on reasonably on time here. Today is Monday. It's June 12th, 2023. This is Dr. Jerome Corsi. I'm here with my producer, Chris. This is thetruthcentral.com, thetruthcentral.com. And by the way, my Twitter account, Jerome Corsi account, just got the blue verification check mark. We fought for that for a while, and it finally happened. And so we'll fight back on these issues and continue to report and write. Thank you for joining us. In the end, God always wins. God will win here too. It may not be easy. And let's hope we can avert a nuclear war in the spirit of 2 Chronicles 7:14. Let's repent that we've allowed it to get to this point. God will intervene. God created this place. God rules this place. And in the end, God will win. Dr. Jerome Corsi will be back tomorrow. Thank you for joining us. God bless.